Hello, hello, everybody, and welcome back to Shatter Our Souls with Novaria. Today, we are tackling the opening and the first planet of Metroid Prime 3 Corruption. So, over the course of this next hour or so, I'm going to be touching base on a lot of the themes that have come across throughout the entirety of the series up to this point, as well as what I believe to be the foundation of what Prime 3 was aiming at being and as far as a game is. Now, excuse the lack of audio in the background at the moment. I had some technical issues and I couldn't go back to fix it, unfortunately, without losing everything. So, for now, unfortunately, this is just what I have. Anywho, with that in mind, welcome, welcome. Um, so before I get too far into this, I want to say that Metroid Prime 3 aimed to be more accessible than any other game in the franchise prior. And this was, I think, done exceptionally well. It aimed to show just what the Nintendo Wii was capable of with a more cinematic experience, far more technologically advanced lay graphical capabilities, and a more streamlined approach to the game as a whole. If you look at games that came prior to Prime 3, I'll even just poke at 1 and 2, there were a lot of branching paths you could go to throughout the game that showcased different plans of attack, different paths had different upgrades, different abilities could be used, etc., etc. This was intended to make it so that the game itself was more open ended. Yes, you would eventually have to find the appropriate path that you're aiming for, but the problem with Prime 3's, I suppose, world building is that many of the areas in the game are just, I suppose, smaller isolated locations. I'm going to use the GFS Olympus, for example. The entire area is actually just two loops. There's one that leads to the garbage disposal, or one section leads to the garbage disposal, and the other leads up and into the maintenance of the ship itself. This is something very simplistic, but it adds character in a different light. This was meant to be the most approachable, reasonable game in the franchise to get our hands on. It was meant to be everything that the prior games had, but be an introduction to the series. With this in mind, Prime 3 did a few things differently. Number one, it made a pseudo fast travel system. This means that every single time that you are stuck in a location like I'm going to pick on Elysia for a moment because it has, to my recollection, at least three different docking bays that you can go to. You can fast travel between them from your ship, which, perfect, very simplistic mindset. Now, I forgot to mention this prior, but I have also turned off the hint system. Any hints that show up throughout the duration of footage here are ones that, unfortunately, I have no control over. And, as has been the norm for this entire channel, I'll be tackling Prime 3 on Hypermode. Now, Prime 3 is ironically the one that I am most cautiously optimistic about for Hypermode difficulty as a whole. When I looked back at what I was considering for Prime 1 and 2, Prime 1 I had deemed to be probably the easiest of the three. It was the one I played most often because the cinematic nature of Prime 3 made it one I didn't necessarily enjoy coming back to as much. But Prime 2, with its entire identity being darker, being harder than its predecessor, it felt like it was the most natural to consider for the hardest game in the trilogy. There is, however, a, I suppose, caveat, a sidestep to that. And that is that Prime 3 added the Hypermode feature. Hypermode in Prime 3 effectively is a risk versus reward system. Your goal in Hypermode is to be as open minded as you can with dealing damage by taking damage. You sacrifice one energy tank worth of health to enter Hypermode. And you can go as hard as you want while you are in Hypermode. Your damage just increases the likelihood of going into a phase-on illness, phase-on sickness, phase-on madness, that's it. Um, with the idea of the more corruption that she experiences, the harder it is going to be for Samus to maintain her sense of control on the world as a whole. This might not seem like much. It's a pretty simplistic piece of information, but it's honestly, it's one of the better put together systems in my mind. But Hypermode was a kind of a late addition to the game if my understanding of its development cycle is to be trusted. So, with that, what I'm getting at is Prime 3 had the issue of its development being a little bit harder for Retro at the time because of what it was and what they were aiming to do. They also aimed for a much more, as I said, cinematic experience. It is effectively meant to emulate or beat Halo, at least as far as I'm concerned, um, at its own game. So there is that to think about as well. Now, I suppose I should really touch base with what exactly the mission itself is. And for that, I believe that Admiral Dane and Aurora Unit 242 will have a much better time explaining than I would. While we're here, let's also meet the other hunters Gore, Rundus, and Gandrada. I mean, Samus? No, Gandrada. So, Gandrada is a shapeshifter. Yeah, you know what? Let's start with this briefing. 242, the Aurora unit, takes the time during this moment to explain what is going on. 242, as well as the rest of the Aurora units, are organic supercomputers capable of being of communication between one another via telepathy. This, in and of itself, is pretty powerful and useful. However, due to a virus that ended up in the system of likely space pirate origin, the the Aurora units had to shut down their network. The scientists of the Federation created a vaccine, and 242 was the first one to receive the vaccine, and it, of course, purged the virus completely. Where does this all tie in? 3 313, I think it is, aboard the GFS Valhalla was the first one infected. And so, I suppose, early game is about trying to deal with the fallout of this situation. The space pirates, because of shutting or used the opportunity, shutting down the network in and of itself, to be able to turn the tide of battle. Effectively, the Federation were caught without any means of communication amongst themselves. And so, the pirates were able to attack the main base of Norion. Well, to a degree. Norion is the first planet that you end up on. The goal of this game is more or less to find and deliver a vaccine to each of the Aurora units in the system. Now, unfortunately, I only know of two other Aurora units in the entire game. 313 from the Valhalla, 242 from the Olympus, and I believe it's 317 or something from Elysia's Skytown. But each of the, I suppose, locations is meant to be a bit of a stronger tie-in to what you're looking at. This moment right here is really important, by the way. That general nod, that casual acceptance between Admiral Dane and Samus. Samus was the last person to leave the room. But it doesn't matter because Admiral Dane treats Samus with a degree of respect that is, I think, hard pressed to come by at any point in time in this series. I've always kind of found it funny. The Federation in the early parts of the series is depicted as a much more open minded group than the later section, where once the pirates were defeated, they almost became a fascist system. Their entire they became a dictatorship not just of a few odd planets, but of the entire system. Okay, that was weird. Um, so that is something to, I think, note in and of itself that the game treats Samus with such respect. And while I'm thinking of it, there are, as you know, three other hunters, total of four. Each of the hunters eventually will be dispatched to one of various planets. Now, I personally think that this is a amazing way to start it off because each planet has an environment that suits the hunter. Brio is the one that Rundus gets sent to. Brio has effectively 48% of its surface is in perpetual darkness. 48% is perpetually exposed to the sun. And there's a little gap, only about a 4% of the world of the planet's surface, that is a verdant paradise, a haven for all those around it. Not too hot, not too cold. The reason I like this particularly is because Rundus has the ability to create ice. He is used to the extreme cold, and he has a system capable of handling the extreme heat. He is, for lack of better terminology, the perfect person to send to the planet Brio. The second is Elysia, a technological paradise with a steampunk aesthetic. I think that's the easiest way to describe it. It's meant to be um the entire planet is, well, what you see of it is a small research station floating above the clouds. Gore, a robot that is 98 or sorry, that only 4-ish% of his original biomass still exists, the rest being entirely based on technology, is again the perfect person to deal with this, capable of both interfacing with anything that can be found on Elysia, but more importantly, is also capable of communicating and preparing to defeat anything that comes his way. He also, because of his technological know how, effectively can get anything done with very limited, I suppose, lost time. The third is Gandrada, and she gets a little bit of a different approach. Gandrada's mission is to seek out the space pirate homeworld. Now, the space pirates that we see in this are not the same as the ones we see in other games. Now, I think it's something that doesn't get touched on too much, but I am aware of a minimum of three different groups of space pirates. The first is the Zabesian. These are the space pirates that typically show up in the 2D games that look more crab like with the giant claws. The Zabesian style space pirates have blasters hewn into their very, I suppose, exoskeletons and are more defense focused than their rival or than the other varieties. The second variety is the more monstrous variety. This one is more akin to what you see in Prime 1 and 2. They're more lizard like. This particular batch, I think, is more similar in speciation to for Kraid or Crocomire, for example. Um, Making them more, I suppose, unique opponents. More, they have less armor than the Zabesian counterparts, but also have less, or have more firepower than their Zabesian counterparts. They also have created means of flight and more readily available travel. The third variety is this one. The version that we see in Prime 3 is almost bug like in nature, at least by what I've seen. They have hints of the lizard like appearance, but they're also corrupted by Phazon. You can see it through the veining throughout their arms and legs that they've been exposed for quite some time. They still seem to have some form of coherent thought, although imagine that this is partially due to the fact that Prime 3s may be affected, or these ones may be affected by something else altogether. That being the Dark Samus itself. This is probably the easiest way I can describe it because I don't believe that it's something that just anything would fix. And truth be told, I'm not 100% sure on it. It is just making conjecture based on the information that I have at this moment in time. But yeah, these ones are more hunched over, slightly more bug like in appearance. What I like about this particular batch of monsters, I suppose, of space pirates is that they're more hostile than the prior ones. But they also have a lot more, how do you say it? How do I want to put this? They have a lot more of a, I suppose, aggressive focus. But they also have a lot more planning to them than other versions that we have seen thus far. And I gotta say, I love that about this particular iteration. But not all things can be perfect. Only most things. So, why do I am getting all about this in the details of what each species of space pirate is about? Well, reality is that I don't think it's something that's looked too heavily into for the duration of the series. There are certainly a few that'll mention that Ridley is, you know, a freaking dragon within this series, but and the only one that we see. But other than that, they're pretty, I suppose, mundane creatures as a whole. There is a couple notable differences between the speciation, but really they're all going to act and approach problems the same way. So that's all fine and dandy. So I suppose the biggest difference between old and new is the old ones, they had specialization or specialized versions of themselves, but the specialized versions were like the elite pirates and the Omega, that being larger than average, bulkier, etc. And I believe that the same type of mutations happened, just at a slightly different species level. The DNA remained relatively the same for this creature, the Berserker Lord. The Berserker Lord is effectively a standard space pirate, but absolutely built to the gills. This guy is a beast of a monster, and also the first boss of the game. Now, the Berserker Lord is kind of a easy first boss, if I'm being honest with myself. It's not one that is built to be difficult. It is built with what I would consider the same mindset as the Torizo was in Super Metroid. Its goal isn't to be a hard boss. Its goal is to push you to learn the mechanics of the game. And if you're not very familiar, it can push you to the brink of defeat. If you are, it's going to be a relatively simplistic opponent to take down. Once again, I'm on Hypermode, so his armor and health pool is going to be significantly higher than normal. But that being said, his health pool is kind of irrelevant. If he can't hit me, he can't outlast me. And that's more or less exactly what this battle is about. It's a battle of attrition. Um, One, I suppose, notable thing is I was intending to talk a little bit about the lore of each planet as they came up. Unfortunately, Norion doesn't really have a whole lot. Most of its lore refers to the mutagen of Phazon and trying to build the basic world building that Metroid Prime 1 and 2 put into motion. This being concepts like Phazon madness, concepts like um, its mutation, its power capabilities, even introducing characters like Dark Samus into the mix in and of itself. The point was about making sure that the players had something to grasp onto that made sense from an early point in time. What I like about this approach, as far as what it meant, is that no player would ever truly go into this blind, provided that they're doing their scans or their scans in general. But also, the more cinematic approach to Metroid Prime 3 means that the bulk of the story as a whole is told to you. You don't need to go digging for it as much as the prior ones had. This is not a deal breaker, but it changes the immersion a little bit. Yes, Prime 1 and 2 had cutscenes, but they were often very short, very to the point type of cutscenes. They were meant to show you what was around and maybe introduce a boss or two like Ridley or the Omega Pirate. They were meant to be short, sweet, and tell a very distinct piece of information that was meant to give you all that you would necessarily need for said circumstance. Prime 3 gives a more direct approach, but it's also multifaceted. It has the direct approach, but it has secret messages hidden in various terminals across the world. It has um, well, I know of one secret message on aboard the GFS Valhalla. It has the lore scans, which tell the story of different planets, including Aether, Talon 4, or at least close pieces of information, tie-ins, so to speak. Not necessarily much that's going to be make or break, but enough information that you'll have an idea of what came before. Anywho, with that out of the way, we are leaving the GFS Olympus. I think that it has served its purpose. Onward to Norian. Now, what the logs do say about Norian is actually pretty unique. Norian, at the time of its discovery, was a desert planet. Think Tatooine from Star Wars. There wasn't really much to it aside from sheer cliffs, sand, and dry everything. It wasn't until the Federation got involved and tried to terraform the planet using their state of the art ideology. They never really specified how it was done, only that it was done. They turned it into a paradise, a livable world on the fringe or the edge of the Federation space. Now, what I like about this piece of information is that it actually ties in why it is such a heavy militarized zone. This planet is meant to act as a barrier against infiltration from space pirates or other beings from the outer rim of the galaxy. Anywho, um, the space pirates have initially attacked this Cis or Norian and took out 3 electric generators. These 3 generators are necessary to use a orbital defense system. Effectively, it's the only thing that can really do a number to the pirates from afar, acting as what I'll call their last line of defense. But for a first effort, it seems kind of last ditch. Um, this orbital defense system, of course, has merit within the overall storyline of the game as a whole. Metroid Prime 3 has, I suppose, a secondary situation that crops up in that Prime 3's overall goal is the world itself is dealing with some severe issues from a storyboard perspective. The planet is under attack from not just the pirates, but also from a creature brought over through a wormhole. This creature is the Leviathan Seed. Now, the Leviathan Seeds are, I feel like they're kind of ill explained. They are masses of stone and biomatter capable of effectively destroying an entire ecosystem on impact. This stonework biomass meteor is sent off from the planet Phase. Now, if you've heard me talk about this series long enough, you've heard of Phase. Phase is not something that I have necessarily left up to the imagination. Rather, Phase is the be all end all of this trilogy. It is the source of the Phazon. It is the source of the scourge, this illness that has plagued the entire galaxy. And I think that's something to keep in mind going forward. The source of everything that's been going on for the entire duration of this trilogy is a result of a planet so far outside of the realm of reasonable space, even with faster than light travel, still ends up too far to reach within a single lifetime. This operation, this being, this planet is meant to be a danger zone, a hot spot of everything that's happened prior. Now, Prime 3, let's back up a moment here. Prime 1 had the Metroid Prime, a being that existed prior to the events of the game, brought over aboard a meteor. The impact crater of the meteor acted as the first major hurdle, shall we say. Reaching the impact crater was one, I suppose, section of the overall goal. Phase wants to reproduce. It is a living, somewhat breathing planet. It has organs, it has a means of reproducing. And so, in and of itself, this is a creature and planet of extreme size, but it bears no malice. That is something that I find interesting about Metroid as a whole is generally speaking, most of the villains in Metroid do not bear malice or hatred. They're not kind. The X Parasite, for example, was a being that was unable to have emotions of any variety. It was there to reproduce, like a parasite does. It is not inherently evil, only, well, only dangerous. Extremely dangerous, but not evil. The how do I want to put this? Phase sent out a series of meteors, approximately 50 years prior to the events of Metroid Prime 3. In in these meteors, one impacted Aether, or Dark Aether, and caused the outbreak of the Ing. One impacted Talon 4 and created I suppose, the great poison that the Chozo so feared during the events of their story in Prime 1. Prime 3 deals with another batch, specifically 4 more. One is sent to Noria. It never reaches its target. And I'm going to be abundantly clear about that. It never reaches Norian. But this is the first time throughout the entirety of the series that planets were specifically targeted. Although it's not the first time that they used wormholes for travel. So, what I like about the wormhole situation is that on Talon 4 and Aether, they mentioned that the impact itself was foresaw in some way. Prime 1's was that they had a means of telling the future to a degree, that everything was going to be that they have created and worked towards would come undone. And they were terrified of the implications of what that would be. And so they looked for solutions before it ever arrived. When it did arrive, there was no means of stopping it because of how quickly it touched down after arriving within their airspace. Same thing with Aether, only they only had enough time in that game to hide. This moment here is probably one of my favorite in the entire trilogy. And it is because of what it is. Rundus comes in, Samus is completely surrounded. He shows up and obliterates 4 space pirate carriers without breaking a sweat. He is a cocky, strong-willed, versatile bounty hunter. But more than that, he carries himself with a level of, I've got this, you don't need to be here. Except with Samus. There's a level of understanding between them. Between the two of us, this should be a breeze. He understands that there is any hunter who has the notoriety and the willpower to get this done. If it wasn't him, it would be Samus. And I say this with all the best of intentions. He has a chip on his shoulder. He wants to prove himself. And his whole goal of trying to prove himself comes across initially as cocky or, shall I say, a little bit on the irritable side. But he is by far one of the most engaging characters in this portion of the trilogy. He is one of very few characters that I think could actually hold their own in a duel against Samus at any point of her adventures. Now, note that he is kind of a questionable character, and I rather hazard a guess that he could probably defect from the Federation if things went haywire, but he seems like the type of person who is very much going to get the job done. And I gotta love that about him. Anyways, Samus, at the moment of what you're seeing, is headed toward Generator 1. Rundus has just helped out Samus at this point in time, and he has decided to go to the exact opposite end of the base to Generator 3, leaving 1 to Samus. Ah, yes, the drones. So, these space pirate drones are. It's not necessarily a boss. I wouldn't call it that by any means. But I believe that these space pirate drones actually do a lot for world building. At, well, not world building. Um, in terms of callbacks to prior battles. This one being that the drones actually function in much the same way that the Hive Mecha did in Prime 1, where there would be a series of drones that orbited around Samus, and their goal being to confuse her prior to actually dealing damage to her. And I think that's something that more hive mind mentality creatures would actually do, which makes me all the more impressed that it's been implemented now with a hive mind mentality creature and drones, which theoretically can be operated multiple at a time as a quote unquote hive mind or a centralized intelligence. It's the little details, it's the little things, right? And even though Prime 3 doesn't necessarily have the same level of attention to detail and world building that 1 and 2 necessarily had, Prime 3 still does so much more than almost any game out there, especially for the time, for world building, for even enemy bot mentalities. It's just astonishing that they managed to pull off what they did and make it as believable as they did for a single player adventure campaign. All right, so Admiral Dane is absolutely terrified of this thing. As I mentioned, the Leviathan Seed. Excuse me, I've been talking for 40 minutes. The Leviathan Seed, of course, shows up just on the outskirts of a planet's gravitational field and immediately gets pulled in. Once it makes impact and lands, that's it. Game over. It would effectively begin to destroy the entire ecosystem. We see this in Prime 1 in its logbooks, so to speak, where once the Leviathan hit, it began to destroy the ecosystem as a whole. It blasted through pretty much every single piece of technology, blasted through anything and everything that ever really mattered. And then it proceeded to poison the ground, corrupt the earth. Oh, hi, Ridley. I gotta say, I love that. It began to corrupt the earth, poison the ground, poison the water supply. Even the air itself in places was dangerous. But it also constantly created phazon, which slowly leached up through the ground and into plant life, algae. And so you end up with this beautifully well crafted horror that is meant to be both terrifying but often misunderstood. And again, this is by design. I think Retro Studios, when it came to the Prime trilogy, knew what they were doing. And if I have any hope, Prime 4, regardless of which direction they take it, closer to Prime 1, 2, or 3, Prime 4 is going to be an absolute behemoth of a game. And I, for one, can't wait. So, we did a little bit of a talk on the first of the hunters. Meet Gore. Gore is actually a rather docile being when he is outside of his exosuit. His whole being is mentality is about productivity in many ways. Only about 8% of his biomass still remains, which is primarily his brain. And his suit, or his primary body, is meant to be a replaceable and consistently controlled version of himself. But when wearing his exosuit, the behemoth he's in, his attitude changes. Now, I kind of like the analogy that is made through My Hero Academia, actually, where the personality of the person is influenced by their abilities. And in this case, his personality is influenced not by his abilities, but by the thing that provides them. And once again, we see yet another instance of the PED suit, or Phazon Enhancement Device. The Phazon Enhancement Device is meant to be I want to call it a catch-all. It is meant to turn even the most mundane soldiers into powerhouses, capable of holding their own against beings like Samus. It is intentional, however, that the Federation uses this, um, I suppose, Phazon in and of itself to create a new weapon, something that is more than the sum of its parts, supercharging their military to make even a singular fighter capable of dishing out enough damage to take down entire platoons. Most are powered by an external backpack of Phazon. And honestly, I kind of am 50-50 okay with this. Now, initially I had no idea where they came across it, only that the Phazon existed. But upon digging through the logbook entries, I found out that the Phazon that they have in the PED suit was actually harvested from Aether. Now, this seems a little bit weird. Why would it be harvested from Aether? But the fact is that after the fall of Dark Aether, the Phazon what that the space pirates were hunting and fighting for was more or less gone. It didn't have any larger effect at that point. So what was left over in the drums that the pirates most likely left behind, because they're not the type to I don't see them as the type to clean up after themselves, would likely be what the Federation found and used, possibly cultivating in slightly more sterile environments for the purpose of using said abilities later on. This is my interpretation. Take it as you will. all interpretations have a degree of plausible deniability. At this point in time, Rundus has officially destroyed, not destroyed, activated Generator 3. And now we're going to head to Generator B or number 2. And this is one of those moments that, again, really showcases what we're up against. But it also showcases just how much support we have. 5-on-1. You're going to need more. Nope, 4-on-1. 4-on-2? 2-on-2. Nope. And you're gone. It's none on none. None on one, 2-on-0, whatever it ends up being. Gandrada can seamlessly integrate herself into any group and be a hidden asset. Gandrada is possibly one of the most dangerous beings in the universe for the sole purpose of she could actually get anywhere without anyone stopping her. And as far as I'm concerned, I've talked a little bit about the various hunters in Metroid Prime Hunters for the DS. Um, the three from Prime 3 are, in my opinion, far more potent and powerful than anything in Prime Hunters had to offer. I could see Spire, Trace, Silex, Candon, um, you name it, all getting in a duel with the hunters from Prime 3. But I can almost guarantee that not a single one of them would have any chance against anything that the hunters from 3 could throw at them. This isn't me trying to hype up the characters to be more than they were. Rather, in my mind, it's just simple facts. Each game treats their characters slightly differently. And how do I want to word this? Metroid Prime 3. Let's start with the Prime trilogy, I suppose. Prime 1, 2, and 3 treat Samus differently. Prime 1 treats Samus as kind of relatively similar to what she was in Super Metroid. Very versatile, fairly close to what she was tackling. She understood the assignments, and she is capable of taking on virtually anyone. That is the Prime 1 Samus. Prime 2 shows a little bit more humanity. And behind that humanity, there's a little bit of fear. There's a couple other emotions behind there. But the Prime 2 Samus is such a one-man army that she absolutely, under no circumstance, would lose in a duel to virtually anybody. Prime 3 features Samus in possibly one of the most vulnerable states we ever see her in. But enough about vulnerability, enough about this minor stuff. What's holding the pillar up but none other than Ridley? Now, this design of Ridley is the one that I was second introduced to. I met Ridley originally through Super Smash Bros. Brawl. And so I knew of Meta Ridley and I knew of whatchamacallit, just standard purple dinosaur Ridley. This version is possibly tells a much bigger story than either of those two forms. This is Meta Ridley, the same being that Samus fought in Metroid Prime. You can see the wings are tattered and torn. They're not as complete as they were in the original appearance. They're made of what looks to be fairly similar material, but what you end up with is something that is not anywhere remotely the same as far as appearance. The second thing you're going to note is that the chest cavity has been sealed shut with what I'd like to call a armored plating made from phazon based materials. At least that's the easiest way to describe it that I can find. The second major piece that you're going to notice is that it has blue and red veining throughout. This suggests that this version of Meta Ridley has actually been steeped in phazon. And I think that's a pretty fair statement to make. The phazon that Meta Ridley is, I suppose, involved with at this moment in time means that it is possibly the least in control version of itself we see, but it is also possibly the most dangerous version that we see from a battle perspective. If that wasn't enough, we're also falling down a 17,000 meter shaft at like, I don't know, 25 meters a second. It's pretty deep. Um, so this battle, I was considering what it would be initially when I had started this challenge because in my mind, Meta Ridley is not a hard boss by any means, but Hypermode, up to this point, Hypermode had beefed up every single opponent I fought against. Some of them didn't really matter too much, like fighting opponents that had specified weak points, creatures like the Powerbomb Guardian or the Hive Mecha, creatures that I had a way around fighting normally. Oh man, that is one of the most vicious strikes that Samus ever makes throughout the entire franchise. She definitely did not like Meta Ridley at all and kind of wanted him out of her hair. And Rundus now saves Samus a second time. And uh, Rundus, in my mind, is easily one of the best characters that shows up. And it's really a shame because he is one of my favorites and has been since day one. After beating the game the first time, I admittedly genuinely forgot about Gore and Gandrada at all. But Rundus always stuck with me. And I feel like I'm not the only one who came to that conclusion, that ideology that Rundus is this larger than life figure. But maybe that's just me. Anywho, we're gonna speed this up just a little bit. As you can see, the meteor has entered Norion's atmosphere, and any and all efforts to stop the meteor up to this point have failed. The defense system that I've been working on building is the last thing that potentially could save the planet from said meteor. Now, that pretty much sums up everything in general. There's no need to get, persnickety about very much of this, but it is nice to note that the game treats this circumstance with as much urgency as it does. Now, I admit that if I had the background music in here, um, it would likely be a lot more cinematic. If you, it's one thing that I unfortunately kind of got stuck with in this circumstance. I wanted this series to be bigger than anything I had made prior. And unfortunately, because I got stuck with a bad situation for one recording day, the audio was buggered for the rest of this video. Thankfully, only one video. I got everything figured out. But I would like to acknowledge that next time there will be a lot more atmosphere to this series as it goes forward. Anyway, little bit of descriptive chit chat. We, of course, rendezvous with the rest of the hunters. They're about to leave me behind, and maybe that would be for the best. Who knows? But this moment right here really sells the urgency of this game and the circumstances that we are in. First things first, the hunters all charge in one after another to set off this computer. And admittedly, Samus is the only one that actually touches the computer, so the other three are there for just, I guess, backup. But everybody starts fighting against Dark Samus immediately. 3 shots fired. A fourth was aimed directly at Samus. But this, I think, is what makes the difference. 3 of those shots landed properly. Only 1 hit Samus. This moment, all 4 characters are now infected with a virus of sorts. Samus is the one with the strongest, well, I shouldn't even say strongest willpower, is the only one conscious enough to send off the signal to fire said weapon, at least prior to her fainting. She ends up in a coma. It lasts about 1 month. But this 1 month coma is probably for the best. And to explain that, we need only look at the rest of the crew. Each member of Samus's hunter troop approached or were infected with a virus that self-generates Phazon. Rest in peace to everybody who got caught in that laser. This self-generating Phazon meant that Rundus, Gore, and Gandrada all had the capability of producing Phazon at will, of a similar vein to what Dark Samus was capable of producing. Samus, much in the same vein, was stuck in the same situation. But the biggest difference between her and them was she didn't take that first shot. Now, note that she's also fought against Phazon numerous times in the past and maybe has built up some form of immunity to it, or maybe has stronger sense of self or willpower than the others did. There's nothing concrete about what I'm saying here. But what we can glean from this is that each of the 4 hunters is now self-generating Phazon with no perceived negative effects to their health. And so, the Federation, bless their hearts, aimed to create 4 super weapons in the form of hunters with PEDs. What makes the Phazon enhancement device so powerful in the hands of these characters is that they have no need for the external backpack. Rather, it can be fueled by the characters themselves. This gives the characters a little bit of a boost to their innate strength, but also gives them a boost to their firepower. All good stuff, right? The Federation loves this type of stuff. But the issue is that by doing this in that way, the hunters are inadvertently told to use Phazon in combat. They are told exactly what to do, how to do it, and why. And that doesn't always sit with me very well. But be that as it may, we are running up on the 1 hour mark, and I want to thank everybody who has watched this video, and spite of the technical difficulties. Thank you all. If you like what you see, drop a like, leave a comment, and I would love to if you would subscribe. Until next time, be good to one another and have a good one.